Hi, I'm Karen MacNeil, and welcome to WineSpeed.com's People to Know, insider interviews with the most fascinating and important people in the wine business. And today we're here with a woman who is truly important, Carole Meredith, Professor Emerita from the University of California, Davis, and co-owner of Lagier Meredith Winery in the Napa Valley. Carole, welcome.
Thank you, Karen.
I might have pronounced Lagier Meredith incorrectly. Is it?
No,
Did I?
You pronounced it correctly. Of course, it's a French name, you know, and in France it's Lagier.
Right.
But when Steve's grandfather came to California from an area in eastern France near Grenoble, when the family came to California, they anglicized the name, as have many French families. You know, so that's why we have Montpelier, Vermont, because
Yes.
Americans don't do too well with French pronunciation. So, but if anybody does pronounce Steve's name the French way, he never dissuades them because he knows it makes him seem better and more impressive in the wine world if he has a French name.
Oh my goodness. Now, you are truly an extraordinary woman. You're a co-founder of the scientific process by which grapevines are identified via their DNA. When did that work happen, and why has it been so important to the wine industry?
That was a process, not an event. So it started in the late 90s, and it pretty much followed the path that was being taken by medical researchers. There's always much more funding and attention and urgency given to biomedical research. And so people working with other organisms usually then try to adapt those discoveries to their own organisms. And that's certainly what was happening in plants. In all agricultural crops, people were looking to human genetics, biomedical genetics, and seeing the great advances with DNA typing, both for criminal purposes, for forensic purposes, immigration, all sorts of applications. And it became pretty clear that those methods could be used on plants. Grape was not the first, that's for sure, because grape is a challenging plant because it's a large plant with a long generation time and not a whole lot of people working on it in the laboratory. It was not one of the first. Plants like corn and tomato and crops where that are much easier to work with in the lab because they have short generation times, and plants that have a lot of human enterprise working on them with a lot of private funding, a lot of seed companies. So grape was not one of the first, but it became really obvious to us in the late 90s that we should be able to apply those advances to grape. And in my laboratory, one of my graduate students, John Bowers, who grew up in St. Helena on Zinfandel Lane, he and I both saw the promise, and some people in Australia at the same time were seeing the promise of applying this technology. But you can't just take the tools that have been developed in medicine and plug them in. You have to, you can use the principles, but then you have to develop them because these tools are based upon the knowledge of sequences, the knowledge of DNA sequences. And so that means you've got to learn something about grape DNA sequences in order to develop the tool. So there was a really long kind of startup time, a long lag phase before we could start to use them. Initially, we just had a very limited toolbox, and we did some pretty limited work, mostly just trying to take some California grapes whose identity was in question because the names had been changed when they got to California, and trying to match them with their European counterparts and seeing if they had the same DNA profile. And that was kind of how we got started, but then we got more and more sophisticated about it. And then the technology in humans was also advancing, and we began to see that the door was really going to open wider for us to do a lot more than simply identify varieties, but to learn more about them, to learn more about the genetics of grapes, to learn more about how they're related to each other, about where they came from. but we would need to expand our toolbox greatly. It's not that it would be so terribly difficult, but it was just so much work to develop all these tools that we knew we couldn't do it alone. So in the early 90s, I went to a conference with a bunch of grape geneticists and proposed that we form an international consortium because we all wanted these tools. None of us had the money or the laboratory human power to develop these tools on our own. And if we were to share the effort and then share the tools, then we could all benefit. And so that's what we did. So we formed what was called the Vitis Microsatellite Consortium. Microsatellite is the name for the kind of DNA marker we were using. And we got about 20 research groups in 10 countries to join up. Wow. And to agree to share all of our results with each other. And we all signed contracts. You should see, trying to get 10 academic institutions, 20 academic institutions in 10 countries across the world to sign contracts that all institutions could agree upon. Oh, it was unbelievable because it meant going to, the University of California attorneys and the INRA in France, their National Agricultural Research Organization, their attorneys in Australia and Chile and so on. Anyway, it got done. We made a lot of progress. And now, of course, now that the grape genome is completely sequenced now, and there's just more information than anybody knows what to do with. But back around, I guess we're talking close to 30 years ago now, we were just getting it off the ground, and it really opened some doors for us.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I remember as a journalist back then being so excited that you finally knew the parentage of grapes, and you understood a bit about where they came from and how the whole history of grapes evolved. But fast forwarding, all of that information now is increasingly important potentially for climate change and disease prevention, if I understand correctly.
Well, it is. It's important for a number of things. Our emphasis, when I was working on it, and I hasten to emphasize here that I don't do this anymore. It's now gone so far past me. I sometimes try to read the papers that are coming out now, and it's just mind-boggling. The advances are just amazing. When I was heavily involved, my main interest was figuring out where the varieties came from and how they were related to each other. And the first thing that we discovered was back in 1997. We discovered the parents of Cabernet Sauvignon. And at the time it was serendipitous. We really had never expected to do something like this. We just had a very small number of varieties that we had examined. And just serendipitously, of about 20 varieties we'd looked at, 3 of them were Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Sauvignon Blanc. And Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc are the parents of Cabernet Sauvignon, and we were so fortunate to discover that. But what that then helps you to understand is it helps you to pin down the geographic origin of a grape, and then simply by deductive logic, the time at which a grape originated, because it's obviously going to be younger than its parents, and if you can learn something about the history of the parents, you can deduce then when the offspring grape arose. So back then we were a little bit more interested initially in identity and second in origins. But I took a lot of satisfaction back then at dispelling myths.
Yes.
Because people had so many wild notions about where certain varieties came from. And they had no facts because those facts simply hadn't existed, and so they were free to make it all up. And people did, it was unbelievable. Cabernet came from Albania, Chardonnay came from Lebanon, Syrah came from Persia.
Right.
And so on and so on. And it just gave me just no end of pleasure to prove that they all originated in France. And because now we had facts, real facts. And that I think was a really important aspect of the work conceptually, is that all of these questions about where these grapes came from now were amenable to scientific investigation, so that we would have factual information that was not really subject to argument. It was a fact. It was a fact.
Yep.
And I think it disturbed a lot of people who had maybe made their livelihoods on making up stories and writing about it. But anyway, but now it's not just grape genetics anymore. Now it has advanced to the point where there's a more appropriate term, and that is grape genomics. Genomics is a term that comes into play once you have extensive knowledge of DNA sequences for any organism, whether it's humans or wine grapes. And then you can start looking for genes, and then you can start looking for similarities between known genes in another organism and what you hope might be a counterpart gene in grape by looking for related sequences. You can go to wild grape species that have evolved in harsh conditions or under severe disease pressure, and you can start asking questions about what it is that makes them special and how are their genes perhaps different than the genes of a commercially cultivated grape, and what might you be able to do to modify that cultivated grape to help it out. Now, there's another thing that comes into play here, and that's just the whole concept of modifying a grape is, of course, a very dicey situation, because that's genetic engineering and that's genetic modification in its modern sense. And there's a very, very large amount of resistance to doing that in any organism, except in microbes that produce our pharmaceuticals. Nobody cares about that at all. Many, many, many modern drugs are produced by genetically engineered microbes.
Right.
Nobody objects to that at all. I said, give me my drugs, you know.
Right.
But when it comes to food, nobody wants you messing with the genomes of the food organisms, even though in almost all cases there's absolutely no harm caused by that. There are certainly some economic problems because certain companies have developed an outlandish amount of power in the field. There are a few ecological consequences if newly created organisms escape and affect the ecology of the organisms around them. But I've never been concerned at all about the health and safety of any kind of genetically modified food. And we've all been eating them for 30 years now, and it's not a problem. There's a new thing going on now that is gene editing, which is a much more highly controlled process where it's entirely possible to make a very, very small, highly directed, highly controlled, and well understood change in an organism by not introducing new genes, but simply making a very, very subtle change in an existing gene. And that's where knowledge of the genome of a wild grape, for example, if you find out that there is a wild grape that is highly resistant to powdery mildew or downy mildew or Pierce's disease, and if you look at the genes of that wild grape and then you compare them to the appropriate genes in a cultivated grape, you might then be able to see a very, very small change that could be made in the cultivated grape to impart that same degree of resistance. Now that can be done theoretically, although I don't know if it ever will be an acceptable thing to do. It's not just consumers, but it's the whole wine trade that is resistant to these sorts of changes because, perhaps more so than any other crop, grapes are just so steeped in tradition and history and culture and place, and it's like, don't mess with wine. Wine is history, and I'm the first one. I mean, I'm very attached to the history of grapes, and so I'm not sure if that's ever going to happen in grapes, but it's a very powerful technology that is there, and who knows, if things get bad enough, if our climate changes enough, that's going to change disease pressure, That's going to change the environmental stresses that vineyards are subjected to. And eventually people may be more willing to accept the application of these new genetics tools because the alternative may be no grapes at all.
That's right, no wine at all.
So, exactly, yeah.
Now, I know that one of the first grapes that you worked on was a grape that you now grow, which is Zinfandel, which has other names in Croatia, where you found it. And in fact, you call your Zinfandel Tribedrag.
Yes.
Yes. That must have been very exciting because it's an example of what you were saying earlier. People had this view that Zinfandel was so-called America's grape, and here it is, a Croatian grape.
For me, that was probably the last major project I worked on before I left the university, which has now been 16 years, I think. And we were always working on multiple things, but the one that probably I kind of closed out my research career with was the Zinfandel. Stop, I have an itchy nose. You know, I've done all these Somm films, right?
So that's right, you have.
Got so much experience now with cut. Right, we all stop, we all scratch, itch, take a sip, cough, laugh.
We're keeping all of it.
This is in Somm.
So, when I started working on grape, one of the things I learned was that Zinfandel was California's own grape. And of all the important grapes in California, Zinfandel was the only one that didn't have a European history. And nobody was quite sure exactly where it came from, but a lot of people were convinced it probably was a native California grape because none of the Europeans had claimed it. There was no other country that used the name Zinfandel. Nobody had ever heard of it, so therefore it was probably California's own grape. Well, that's all well and good if you're not a scientist. But if you're a scientist and you know something about grapes and wild grapes and all the different grape species and what part of the world they grow in, then you know that yes, we have some wild grapes here in California, but they're not Zinfandel. They're nothing like Zinfandel. And Zinfandel is very clearly a European grape.
Yes.
You can just tell by looking at it if you know something about grapes. So all my predecessors at UC Davis knew that it was a European grape. They didn't know where it came from, although people had had some ideas. And one of the first ideas that emerged was in the 1970s when my former colleague Austin Goheen, who was a grape disease specialist, he was attending a scientific conference in southern Italy near Bari in the Apulia region. And after the daily sessions were over, everybody would hang out in the local bars and drink wine. And he's drinking wine with an Italian counterpart of his, a guy named Giovanni Martelli, who was also a grape disease specialist. And they're talking about grape diseases. And Austin Goheen is sipping this wine, and he says, "Wait a second, Giovanni, what is this?" And Giovanni says, "Oh, it's just the local red." You know, nobody paid attention to what the name of the grape was. It's just the local red. And Austin says, "But this tastes like Zinfandel. Can I see the vines?" And Giovanni says, "Well, yes, tomorrow we can go and look at some vines." So the next day they go to a nearby vineyard, and they look at the vines. And Austin Goheen says, "Well, that looks like Zinfandel." And Giovanni says, "Well, no, that's Primitivo." And Austin said, "Well, can I get some cuttings and bring them back to Davis so that we can compare it?" And so Austin did that. They planted them in the UC Davis vineyard next to Zinfandel. They looked alike, you know, walk like a duck, talk like a duck. It's got to be Zinfandel. And the only means they had at that time, around 1970, early 70s, the only means they had to try to resolve identities was appearance.
Right.
Especially leaf appearance. That had become quite a highly sophisticated tool. It's called ampelography. It's based on the Greek word, ampelos is vine, graphos is description. So vine description, just looking at the vine, especially the leaves. There are thousands of grape varieties, and many of them have very similar grape clusters, but they have very distinctive leaves. The leaf size can vary, the depth of the lobing, whether there are sharp teeth along the borders of the leaf, whether there are hairs on the top of the leaf, hairs on the bottom, all sorts of details that could help people distinguish grape varieties. And this Primitivo and this zinfandel planted side by side, their leaves were identical. But that's as far as it could go. And it wasn't really until probably about 20 years later when we were just developing our rudimentary DNA tools. They were not very sophisticated at the time, but one of the first things we did was, because we had the material right there, let's compare Primitivo and zinfandel. What do you know? Perfect match. And so that was kind of the first DNA evidence we had. That was around 1990, I think, that these were indeed the same grape. But then as time wore on, and I got to know some Italian researchers too, they would say, well, okay, they may be the same grape, but it's not an Italian grape. We have records. We know that Primitivo arrived in Apulia probably in the 1700s, so it's not a native Italian grape. So then the question arises, of course, well, if it's not Italian, where did it come from? Look at a map. That's what everybody needs to do more often than not, is to look at a map. Whether you're studying the spread of a coronavirus or looking at the origins of grapevines, look at the map, because geography is everything. And so if you look at a map of Italy and you look at the Apulia region, that is the heel of Italy. And on the heel of Italy is along the Adriatic Sea. The Adriatic Sea is a very narrow sea, and on the other side, not very far away, a short ferry ride, is what we now call Croatia, what centuries ago was called Dalmatia, and it's been a grape growing and winemaking country for millennia. I mean, one of the very, very first. And so this had occurred to people before me at Davis also, that possibly Croatia, or back then it was Yugoslavia, it's had a lot of different names, that perhaps that's where zinfandel came from. And a couple of people at Davis had some interactions with Yugoslavian and Croatian researchers, and had looked at another grape there in Croatia called Plavac Mali. And Plavac Mali was and still is the predominant premium red wine grape of the coastal area of Croatia. It makes a very hearty, deep-colored red wine. And when people looked at, and so of course Austin Goheen got in some cuttings from Croatia of Plavac Mali too, planted them side by side. We looked at the DNA of Plavac Mali compared to Primitivo and zinfandel, not the same. And we had to leave it at that. At that point, they were not the same. But as our DNA tools evolved, I began to feel like, as our tools get better and better and better, we're going to be able to delve into this more deeply. We're going to be able to say a lot more than it's not the same or it is the same. We're going to be able to say, well, if it's not the same, is it close? How close? And that's going to lead us. It's going to give us a path to go down. So around the mid-90s, I think it was, maybe it was around 95, 96, I began to think that we had the tools that maybe we could be the ones to answer this question. And wouldn't that be exciting? That would really be exciting to finally put the question to rest. And I thought that maybe we'd be able to do it. But the big problem was I didn't know anybody in Croatia. And if you're trying to do research on varieties in another country, sure, we had a couple of them at UC Davis, but we needed a lot more than that. I needed to know somebody in Croatia. I needed to work with people in Croatia. I needed to go to vineyards in Croatia. I didn't know anybody. The only person I knew from Croatia was Mike Grgic.
Yes.
And so I started talking to Mike Grgic. and who, of course, is Croatian. He's the most famous Croatian in California. And I talked to him, and he had long felt that Zinfandel came from Croatia. He thought it was Plavac Mali, because Plavac Mali is so important in Croatia, and that was what he was familiar with, and he could taste the similarity. And so he was sure that Plavac Mali was Zinfandel. I told him, well, sorry, we already know that's not the case, but I really want to go there and try to find out. Do you know anybody? Can you help me? And he really didn't, because he's a winemaker and he really didn't know any scientists. So I was kind of stymied. So then there was a serendipitous moment. So by now we're in 1997. We had already done our Cabernet Sauvignon work, and that had become fairly well known because it was kind of groundbreaking, because it was the first time anybody had identified conclusively, inarguably, the origin of a classic wine grape. You know, it really kind of was a lot of people, there were some old people, kind of the old guard in grapevine research, who refused to accept it. I had colleagues at Davis who just wouldn't believe it. And then I had colleagues in Europe when I would go to meetings, and no, can't be, just can't be. Of course, they don't even know what DNA is. These were like another generation. But among a younger generation of researchers, our work had become fairly well known. And in December of 1997, I got an email from a geneticist in Croatia.
Perfect.
And his name is Ivan Pejic. And he's a professor at the University of Zagreb. And he is a plant geneticist. And he sends me this email, and he says, "Dear Dr. Meredith, my name is Ivan Pejic. I'm a professor at University of Zagreb. I'm working with my colleague here, Eddie Maletic, and we are trying to better understand our indigenous grapevine varieties here in Croatia before we lose them. Because with increasing globalization, there's a lot of pressure on our growers to grow international varieties. We know we have a valuable, important heritage here. We need to know what we have, what is different than the rest of the world, so that we can preserve it. If it's the same as the rest of the world, fine. If we have Chardonnay, we're not too worried about losing it, you know.
Right.
But whatever we have that is unique to us, we want to make sure that we preserve it. We think that your DNA tools could really help us. Would you be willing to help us?" And I said, "Well, yes. As a matter of fact, I would be willing to help you if you will help me find Zinfandel in Croatia, because I think it's there." And he, of course, says, "Well, what's Zinfandel?" Because he's never heard of it. So I explained to him what Zinfandel is. And to cut a long story short, that was December. In May, we were shaking hands in Zagreb. And we were off.
Wow.
And on that very first trip, Mike Gergich was able to help in that the time that we spent in the central part of the Dalmatian coast, he has a house, and he put me up. So that, so he was
Right.
he was very helpful, and he was a very important contact to have. So I began to work then with Ivan Pejic and Eddie Maletic at the University of Zagreb. And initially, we were still thinking maybe it is Plavac Mali, but maybe there's more than one kind of Plavac Mali. And maybe the kind that we had at Davis that we knew didn't match, maybe that was the wrong kind of Plavac Mali. Let's look at a lot of Plavac Mali. So we got a lot of examples of Plavac Mali from all along the Dalmatian coast. I brought all the samples back to UC Davis because it wasn't yet possible for the folks at the University of Zagreb to analyze DNA. Brought it all back to UC Davis. We analyzed it all. It was all the same, and none of it was Zinfandel. So that hypothesis we had to scratch. So then we needed, I still knew it had to be there. It had to be there. We just had to look more widely. So at the same time, what Ivan and Eddie had been wanting to do all along was to look at all their old traditional Croatian grapes. And so they were already starting to sample a lot of different vineyards, and I wasn't with them. They're tromping around in vineyards, talking to old growers, trying to stay away from the most mainstream vineyards because those were more likely to be Plavets Mali or Merlot or Chardonnay or something. But if they wanted to find stuff that was unusual and important for their purposes, they needed to find old vineyards that were tucked away. And so they did a lot of I gotta think of the word, prospecting. They did a lot of prospecting by talking to people and investigating. And by the way, the same thing has been done in France. When French researchers have been trying to find important clones, they do the same thing. They try to get away from the mainstream growers, and they go talk to the old folks who maybe have something a little more unusual.
Right.
So Yvonne and Eddie collected samples from a lot of interesting old vineyards. Some of them they absolutely knew were not Zinfandel. They didn't look like Zinfandel, but I had agreed all along to help them figure out what they had. So they started this process of sending samples to us by FedEx, and I would get an email saying, I just put it in a box with FedEx, and here's the tracking number, and the next day it would arrive, and we'd analyze it as quickly as we can. And we were, on the one hand, looking for a match with Zinfandel. On the other hand, just looking to see what they had, and was it unique? Was it different? We already, by that time, had a database of hundreds and hundreds of mainstream European wine grapes. So we wanted to make sure that their samples weren't just some mainstream thing, and if it was something unique, then that was important to them. But we're also looking for a match to Zinfandel. This went on for 3 years.
Oh, wow.
So we had started in the spring of 1998, and I would get these batches, every couple of months. I would get these batches from Yvonne and Eddie with these emails, and the emails will say, well, we've got 13 samples we're sending to you, and some of them they knew the names of the varieties, the traditional names. But then there'd be one, they'd say, this might be Zinfandel. And they would always have a number that they'd given it, like a sample number. This might be Zinfandel. So we'd get the samples, and of course we'd look at that one first off, and a couple of days later we'd have the answer, sorry, it's not Zinfandel. And then a couple of months later, another package would arrive. I think this one's really going to be Zinfandel. This is always Yvonne saying this, because he was really on it, and he thought it was going to be Zinfandel. And we'd have to say, sorry, it's not Zinfandel. And pretty soon it was kind of like the boy who cried wolf. Every time we'd get these emails, and this has got to be Zinfandel. But finally, 3 years after we started, in the fall of 2001, I get an email saying, oh, here comes 15 samples, and there's one of them in there, and it's number IP30. And IP stands for Ivan Pajic. That was his designation. And I know this one's Zinfandel, and I'm saying, yeah. That arrives, a couple of days later, we get the analysis, it matches.
Oh my goodness.
It matches, and it was so exciting.
I
It was
bet.
just 3 years, And in the meantime, we've learned a lot about Croatian grapes. We've answered all their questions about what they have and what's important. It's really served their purposes well. And finally, I got my answer too. So it took us 3 years, and that was actually kind of just the beginning, because at that point, that was one sample, and that was in a vineyard. It was a Plavets Mali vineyard with about 5,000 vines in it. But the vineyard had been propagated with budwood from a neighboring vineyard. And so Yvonne and Eddie started looking through this vineyard that their sample had come from, and they actually found a total of 9 vines in that vineyard, all scattered, that were Zinfandel. But for a long time, that was the only vineyard. And then eventually they found another vineyard quite some distance away. It was actually growing in an old woman's front yard. There was a vine, and that turned out. So the vines that they found in the first vineyard, turns out, did have a local name, and the local name was Syrah Kashtelensky. And that simply means the local red from Castella. The town it was in is Castella. And so Castellansky means from Castella. And Cyrillianic means red. So it was just basically a very generic name. When they found the vine in the old woman's front yard some distance away, the locals there said, well, that's Pribidrag. That's Pribidrag. You know, it's been around for ages. Nobody grows it anymore, but that's what it is. And that was pretty much the end of it. It was just those two places and nowhere else, even though they had a few other candidates they thought might be it, but they weren't. Well, then Yvonne and Eddie were looking in a museum. There's a museum in the city of Split, which is right in the heart of Dalmatia. It's an old Roman city. It's a fantastic place. And there's an important natural history museum there. And in there is an herbarium collection of dried leaf samples from all the wine grapes that were grown in that region around 1900.
Wow.
And there are something like 90 varieties in there. And so Yvonne and Eddie looked at all of these, and they came across one of them, and these are dead, right? These are pressed, dried, but they, as I told you, the leaf is very important, the leaf shape. You can't press a grape cluster, but that doesn't matter, it's the leaf. So they came across one that had a leaf that looked just like zinfandel. And it had been collected in a vineyard around 1900, and the name was Tribidrag. And so Yvonne and Eddie said, well, this has got to be Zinfandel, because we know that one of the local names is Pribidrag, and here this is Tribidrag, but it's dead. We can't analyze the DNA, so maybe we're just going to have to live with the knowledge that it's probably Zinfandel, but we can't prove it's Zinfandel. So at the same time, though, let's try to research this old grape called Tribidrag and see what we can learn. So they got a local historian involved, a guy named Ambrose Tudor. And he got involved, and he was able to trace the name Tribidrag by tax records, land records, trade records.
What a story.
Inheritance records, people's wills. It was a really, really important grape, and he traced it back to the 1300s, including a record found in Venice, which was a city-state back then that did a tremendous amount of trade with the city of Split. And so there were barrels of Tribidrag going to Venice. So we knew that it was a really, really important grape back in the 1300s, but we couldn't prove it was Zinfandel until 10 years later. So, I mean, this is protracted, you know? So 10 years later, Yvonne and Eddie got to know, or became aware of, some researchers in Croatia whose specialty was archaeological sites. They weren't grape people at all, but they would try to analyze DNA that they would get out of materials that they found in archaeological sites, including like wood, you know, and stuff that you would think would be completely dead, but they were successful in getting DNA. And so Yvonne and Eddie said, you want to try this? And so they went back to the museum, and they talked to the curator of that herbarium collection, who by then, you know, knew the importance of this, and said, can we take some samples of these dead leaves? And they agreed. And I've got a photograph. They used a paper punch, and I've got a photograph of this beautiful herbarium specimen of this leaf that looks like Zinfandel with little holes punched out. And the archaeological specialists then were able to take those little discs of dead leaf and get DNA out. Now, they couldn't then analyze it because they didn't know anything about grape, but they were chemically able to get the DNA out. And by then, we're talking 2011 now, and Ivan and Eddie, they know perfectly well how to analyze DNA. They've been doing it for years now in their own labs. They analyzed it, it matched, and it was like the end of the story. You know, and finally we get to, that was just the last little segment to connect the dots. So by then I was retired. You know, I hadn't been in a research lab in years, But of course, I'm still very much involved with the whole thing, and we're corresponding back and forth all the time. So it was just so satisfying to get that closure and to finally be able to tell the story. And so having gotten that closure and realized, coming from the very beginning where people were thinking Zinfandel was a California grape, to finally being able to get to the answer, not only is it a European grape, we know where in Europe it came from, we know how old it is at least. So we know it's at least 800 years old, which is like twice as old as Cabernet Sauvignon. So, let's give this grape some credibility here. This is a noble European grape, and that's why the Zinfandel that we produce on my vineyard goes by the name Tribidrag.
Wow, what an incredible story. Now, speaking of your vineyard, I want to just ask you a couple of questions about this. You have a wonderful vineyard up on Mount Veeder in the Napa Valley with your husband, Steve, and you decided to do everything just yourselves. Even though you're a scientist, you kind of do this vineyard, work the vineyard the old-fashioned way. You do all the pruning, you have no employees, no chemical inputs. Why did you decide to do it this way? I mean, Steve's famous in the industry, you're famous in the industry, you probably would have had 100 winemakers raise their hand right away and say, I want to be her winemaker.
No, students from Davis who want to come and work for us.
Maybe, yeah.
Well, Steve and I, now we have a small vineyard and wine brand, and now we actually make our living off it. But when we first started, we had no intention of doing that. We bought our property because Steve took a job at Robert Mondavi winery on the winemaking staff in 1985. We had been living in Davis. Steve worked at the university too. And there's no way that Steve could continue to live in Davis and work at a winery where he sometimes needed to be at work at daybreak, during harvest. We thought about living halfway in between and splitting the commute. And whereas Napa was beautiful and temperate and a lovely place to live, Davis was flat and hot, but had a really exciting culture because it's a university town. We had hoped maybe we could find the best of both worlds in the middle. We found the worst of both worlds. Every place in between was flat and hot and had no culture at all. And so we just kept gravitating towards Napa. And I had enough flexibility in my position that I agreed that I would be happy to live in Napa and I would just drive. And I had grown up in the East Bay Hills, which are very similar to these hills. And so for me, this was a very comfortable environment. Anyway, the vegetation's familiar, the climate's familiar. So I was happy to settle in Napa. And we looked at a lot of properties, and we looked at 70 properties.
Oh.
We finally settled on the one that was like number 10 or 11 that we had rejected early on because it had a 1.5 mile long dirt driveway that climbed 1,000 feet. That was just ludicrous. And why would anybody ever live up here? It was a 4-wheel drive access road to get to the place. But by the time we had seen 70 places, it kind of grew on us, and it had a fantastic view. And we kind of started thinking, maybe we could plant some grapes for ourselves. And Steve was thinking maybe he wanted to make some wine for himself, because when you're working for a very large winery, you're just a small cog in a big machine. And he thought it would be fun to make some wine from his own vines. So we bought the place. The previous owner had cleared the trees. This is a very forested, deeply forested area. Mount Veeder is redwoods and Doug firs. It's really a thick forest. But the previous owner had removed a lot of trees, which enabled us to see that it could be vineyard. He had left quite a mess, though. So for the first 8 years, we cleaned up the mess, which was things growing back, tree roots that had been left in the ground. And we finally got it kind of prepared, got it sown to a grass cover crop to prevent the soil from eroding away. And we also were very concerned about a disease called oak root fungus, which is a fungal disease that it's a fungus that's actually beneficial to wild trees in the forest. It helps them to acquire nutrients from the soil, but it's a lethal pathogen on wine grapes. And we already knew that when you plant a vineyard into an area that has very recently been forest, there's a very good chance that that fungus is still in the soil, and it will infect your new grapevines and kill them. So we also knew that if you leave that soil fallow for a few years, that fungus will die off, and then you'll have a much better chance of having a healthy vineyard. So that's why we waited 8 years. We bought the property in '86, planted our first vines in '94, and then got our first fruit in '96, and it was Syrah. Made our first wine in '96. We planted Syrah for a couple of different reasons. So now this is the mid-'90s. There wasn't a lot of Syrah in California at the time, but it was starting to kind of make itself known. There were a couple of Central Coast Syrahs. There were a couple of Napa Syrahs. And we loved Northern Rhone Syrahs. And Jean-Louis Chauve from the Chauve family in the Northern Rhone had spent a year at Davis, and we had gone to visit him, and we'd actually stayed with him and shared old wines with him and his father, and we were just so fond of Syrah that we decided we're going to plant Syrah. In addition, Steve was working at Robert Mondavi Winery, which is a Cabernet house, and he thought that he didn't really want to compete with his employer.
Yes.
And then the third reason, so we really love Syrah. Steve didn't want to compete with his employer. The third reason is that I am really sensitive to tannins. I mean, just excruciatingly sensitive. I cannot enjoy a Cabernet that's less than 10 years old. It's just too bitter and astringent for me. And so I didn't really want to plant Cab. And so, besides, does Napa need another Cabernet, you know? So we planted Syrah because that's what we wanted to drink ourselves. And at the time, we had no plan. We weren't making this wine for anybody else. We were just making it for us. So we planted some Syrah. In 1996, we made some. In 1997, we took it to a tasting that some friends of ours were having. And many of our friends are winemakers, and this happened to be a winemakers tasting group. And it's always blind. The theme was California Syrah. They knew we were making some. They said, why don't you bring yours along? And it's all brown bag. The unanimous first choice of everybody at the tasting was our Syrah.
I love that wine. That wine is a phenomenal Syrah.
So, you know, that was the watershed moment for us, because at that point, we were just making wine for ourselves with no plans to do anything beyond that. We both had full-time jobs, and we're both of the generation that you get a job and you stick with it until you retire, and that's your job. That's your career, you know? And now what we realize is that that's no longer necessarily the only option for people. You can have serial careers. Yeah. And so we began to think more and more about maybe selling this wine, doing it commercially. So in '96 and '97, we were just making homemade wine, because you can't make a commercial wine. You can't retroactively declare your wine commercial. You have to make it in a bonded facility, and then you have to have the appropriate permits in order to sell it. And so we thought, well, let's do it then, but it'll have to be '98. That'll have to be the first commercial vintage. And so we jumped on it and found a bonded facility in which to make it, because the '96 and '97 hadn't been in that kind of place. And we very quickly learned how to get a permit from the federal government, and we learned how to get permits from every place else that we needed to get permits from. And so '98 was a commercial wine produced in bond, and we were authorized to sell it. And so then we didn't sell, of course, for a couple of more years. And so in 2000, we offered our first wine for sale, our '98 Syrah. We had 74 cases. Now, at that time, there was no e-commerce.
Right.
There was barely a World Wide Web, but there was kind of an embryonic wine chat world out there. And there was a group called West Coast WineNet, run by a guy in San Diego. And we already knew about it. I'd known about it since before we ever made wine. And we had participated in it a little bit. And so we just said, well, a couple of people already knew that we were going to have a commercial wine. And we said, well, it's ready now. And I learned how to make a very rudimentary website for us, just extremely simple, with a button to click that says download an order form. It was a Microsoft Word document. You download the order form, fill it out, and fax it to us, and that was e-commerce. The thing is, it worked. People faxed us orders. We had no idea how to ship, but we learned how very fast. And so we sold out our 74 cases pretty fast, and then we were off and running. And of course, the next year we had more, and then we had more. We started planting a little bit more. And then we began to think, we can develop an income stream here. Do you think it's possible we might be able to replace our day jobs? And so now, I should backtrack a little bit, because what had happened was Steve left his day job before we even released our first bottle of wine, because we kind of saw that coming. We saw in 1999, we could see that this was going to have some viability, and we also knew we wanted to plant a little bit more, and Steve would need more time in order to do this. And so he left his job at Mondavi, which was also becoming less interesting because he was working on the coastal brand, and that was a very high volume brand, and they wanted him to spend more time on the Central Coast, and it just wasn't. So they kind of agreed to separate. So Steve left his job at Mondavi. I, of course, continued to work at Davis, but starting in the year 2000 and each year after that, we would release a little bit more wine. We began to develop a bit of a following, and it was still just Syrah, only Syrah. And then in 2007, we thought we'd like to diversify a little bit, because we're kind of a one-trick pony, okay? We know how to make the Syrah. We know it's good Syrah. We know people like it. But it would be nice to have something else, especially another red. And I had done some research at Davis on the origins of Syrah. And it was just coincidental that we ended up planting Syrah, but I had also, my group had discovered the parentage of Syrah. And Syrah's father is a black grape from west of the Rhone River called Dureza. And Syrah's mother is a white grape from east of the Rhone River called Mondouse Blanche. And that's an old white grape. So Syrah has a white grape as a mother, just like Cabernet. Sauvignon has a white grape as a mother, Sauvignon Blanc. And it turns out there's a lot of black grapes that have white grapes as mothers. So it's kind of like brown eyes and blue eyes, So anyway, so Syrah's mother is Mondouse Blanche. And Mondouse Blanche, it is the offspring of a black grape called Mondouse Noir, which is an old Savoy grape, been there forever, and makes a wonderful wine that is known to age for decades. It's kind of a light-bodied, light-colored wine in the Savoy. They have a very short season there. It's like a Pinot body with a Syrah nose. It's a really nice wine. And so Steve and I thought, well, if we're going to plant another red grape, we were really intrigued by this Mondouse. And it had been in California historically for a long time, going by the misnomer of Refosco. Refosco is an Italian grape. What was growing in California under the name Refosco was Mondouse. And of course we had already, I'm sorry, I poked you. That's okay. We had already shown many years earlier that what was going by the name Refosco in California was indeed the French Mondouse. We had compared them all. So, and there still was Mondouse in a lot of old mixed black vineyards, but there was hardly any pure stands of Mondouse, just a couple. So we thought we would plant some Mondouse, and so we planted about 400 vines, just not much, just a tiny little block, and that was in 2007. So we had planted Syrah in 94, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, still Syrah. And finally in 2007 we planted the small block of Mondouse, and in 2009 released our first non-Syrah wine, which was Mondouse, just very, very, and I say Mondouse because that's how we say it here. Just like everybody says my husband's last name, Lagier. And when Wink Lorch came through Napa a few months ago, she came to see us because she's expert on the Sauvignon grapes, and so she said she really wanted to see California Mondouse in situ. And so she came to visit us, and we had a very long discussion about how you pronounce that grape. And in France, it's Mondouse. Mondouse. E-U-S-E is us. So it's, you have to stick your jaw out, so it's Mondouse. But it's very hard for Americans to do that. We all like to rhyme it with mongoose, it's mongoose. So anyway, but it's, but if we ever have French visitors, as we did a couple of days ago, I'm very careful to say Mondouse. It's very hard for me to say the word. So we planted that, and then a couple of years after that, we planted a little bit of Malbec, and that's when we planted the zinfandel.
Right.
And so now we grow 4 grapes. It's still about half Syrah, so that's about half of our production. Our total production has never gone over 1,000 cases. I mean, we are the micro of the micro. You said something earlier about how we do all our own work. Well, there's 2 reasons that we do all our own work. First of all, the vineyard's small enough. It's only about 4.5 planted acres. Our property is over 80, but it's all forest except for the small 4.5 acre vineyard. So it's small enough that we can do all the work, but also our economics, being such a small producer, that we have to do all the work because otherwise it wouldn't pencil at all. We sell primarily direct to consumer, which is, I mean, even with us doing all the work, that's the only way it'll pencil, is if we sell most of it at retail price. But that works fine because we've never really wanted to be large. We always wanted to stay small. We never wanted to build an empire. People are always saying, well, how big are you going to get? How big? No, that's not the point. What we want to do is to produce a wine with our own hands on our own property and see people enjoy it. And that, Steve just gets just the greatest thrill out of that. I mean, that's what he lives for, is to see people enjoying his wine.
It's got to be an incredibly big high.
Yeah. And I must emphasize that Steve is the winemaker. I am not the winemaker. I don't know how to make wine. I do know quite a lot about grapevines. I work in the vineyard, and I have opinions about what we do in the vineyard, and they're not always the same as Steve's. And so we have to make some compromises in the vineyard. But in the winery, it's his deal. He is the winemaker. I taste everything, but he makes the decisions. He makes the picking decisions. He makes all the winemaking decisions. Our wine is very much a vineyard wine, though. Our winemaking is very hands-off. We don't do any extended maceration. We don't do any cold soaks. We don't use any new oak. It's entirely neutral Francois Frere French oak barrels. So it's pretty much an expression of the vineyard, and that's always what we have wanted it to be. We know that what makes our wine distinctive is the place. Anybody can buy fancy barrels, and anybody can do all kinds of, you can stir the leaves, do whatever you want in the winery. But what nobody else can do is have our fruit from our place, and so that's where all of our energy goes.
Story. So lastly, Carole, I want to ask you, you've had hundreds, perhaps thousands of students, including many of the top winemakers, certainly in California, and many around the world. What is it? Were you a natural-born teacher? Because you could have been a research scientist who did not teach. What is it about teaching that you love?
Well, I hate to burst your balloon.
You hate teaching.
I never loved teaching.
Oh my goodness!
Never
really?
loved teaching. I never sought to become a teacher. Professorial positions are by their very nature teaching positions. That's what a professor is. In the sciences at a research university, that position usually carries a split appointment, research teaching. In most of the agricultural sciences, it's kind of 75% research, 25% teaching. So that usually means in a quarter system where you've got three academic quarters, usually someone will teach one or two of those quarters and just teach one course. And so most of the time is spent on research. And of course, it's a perish or publish environment. And so it's absolutely essential that you develop financial support by writing grants. You submit grants to government agencies, to foundations, to producer organizations. And in order to get money, you have to convince those various entities of the significance of your proposed research, the reason you're the best qualified to do it, and the likelihood of its success, and why that information will be important. And so that's what I would have to spend most of my time doing, was writing grant proposals, and the funding that comes with those grant proposals. A small part of it is to purchase equipment. A large part of it is to pay people. So if you have PhD graduate students who want to work with you, typically they will be supported at kind of a half-time rate to do research that will further their academic program, but also it fits in with the research program of the lab that they're working in. Now, then there are also permanent staff, like I had a couple of lab managers who full-time made sure everything was working. There would be undergraduate students who would be washing dishes and doing a lot of routine tasks. And then also there would be visiting scholars. And so scientists from other countries who wanted to learn more about what we were doing so that they could then take it back to their own countries. And with our DNA profiling work, we had a lot of people come through to kind of learn hands-on how to do that. Probably the best known one is José Vuillamos, who is the third author with Jancis Robinson on wine grapes. He came to me in 2001. His background had been working on Swiss medicinal plants. He's a Swiss scientist. And he came and spent a year with me and learning about the grape stuff. And so now he's a grape expert. He's gone on and developed quite a name for himself as a real expert on grape DNA. And he's made a lot of interesting findings, especially in the whole Pinot family and some of the Swiss varieties that are so interesting and unusual. So my teaching then, I think I was good at it. I put a lot of effort into it, but my heart was never in it. My head was 110% in it. I worked very, very hard at trying to do a good job of organizing information and communicating it, as do you, of course. You understand the challenge there. It's not enough to have a bunch of stuff in your head. You have to know how to package it, how to organize it, package it, convey it in a way that's interesting and useful. So I spent a lot of time doing that. The course that I probably spent most of my time teaching was the freshman level general education course that always has a couple of hundred students every quarter, and that's Introduction to Wine Production, where you start off with the whole history of grapes, the geography of grapes, all the microbiology of winemaking, the viticulture, ending up with all the sensory perception. And so it's, it just runs the gamut. And so I taught that for many years. That went on to become a distance education course and still is a distance ed course where now people, they can stream the video through University Extension. So that was where most of my teaching effort went. And I think I did it well, but it wasn't my passion.
I think I'm sure I did take that course, and I remember the 13 or 23 or 33 black.
Were they the video cassettes? The box,
cassettes.
right? The box.
This is very dating.
Yes.
Very
Yes,
dating.
that's
Well,
right. That's right.
Carole, thank you. And our full interview with Carole Meredith is on WineSpeed.com's People to Know page. It's an extraordinary story, as you can tell. Check it out. You'll really like it.